All right. Thank you, Jessica. My name's Charlie. Connie and I will introduce ourselves in a moment, but just want to describe for you what this session is about. It's really a jam-packed session. We're trying to put in as much information as possible here. So we have 5 main things that we want to cover. One is talking about our current predicament with regards to where we are in terms of training, how that's moved online and has gone virtual, and some of the challenges with that. Number 2 is we want to synthesize for you what some of this Zoom fatigue is, this webinar strain is, why that causes some strain, why it poses some challenges. Third is we want to talk about solutions. Blended learning is something that has been around for a while, but we want to describe a new approach with respect to blending that can help you overcome the challenges and some of the drawbacks of VILT or virtual instructor-led training, but also give you opportunities to do new things that you couldn't have done in a face-to-face training. So things that are very interesting and exciting. And then we'll walk through a simple framework, 5 steps to approach and design what a blended program that can consist of some live and non-live elements, what that could look like. And then Connie will walk through a recent case study that has been very successful that's incorporated this type of solution. All right. I do want to remind people that we will make sure to send everyone these slides afterwards so that you can have them for reference. Quick introductions. I'm Charlie. I'm the VP of Business Development, as well as I lead our solutions consulting team at NovoEd. As part of NovoEd, we provide a learning platform. We're used by large organizations, executive education providers, training firms to really put together deep learning journeys. And we really focus on the technology side of it. I've been working there for 5 years and have worked with all different kinds of organizations to go entirely digital, hybrid digital, in a blended approach. So a lot of these best practices that we're going to put in this session are things that we've picked up over time that I want to share with all of you. Connie.
Hi, I am Connie Schimmick. I am the Director of Innovative Learning for Entelechy. At Entelechy, we design and deliver leadership development for permanent change. I consult with clients to maximize their current learning technology and introduce them to new and emerging technologies. I've worked there for about 10 years, and I've worked with Charlie and NovoEd for many of those years. So we are excited to bring you this information.
All right, super. Thank you, Connie. So first, let's start with a little bit of context. Where were we pre-pandemic? So let's look at trends from over a couple of decades up through the end of 2019, all right? So there's blue bars here, which represent in-person training. Green bars represent online training. Most of this data is coming from ATD. We cite the source down below. What you can see is there's a gradual trend up towards online training. And in the past few years, it reached a threshold of actually surpassing or hitting 50%. So 50% of all corporate training programs were starting to be done online. There's another nuance here with the dark shaded bars and the light shaded bars. The dark shade are the higher level skills like leadership, design thinking, agile, some of those things. And what you can see is that most of the dark shades were still primarily done in person with the dark blue bars. And in the dark green bars, you do see that starting to grow. So there were attempts to put more of this richer, deeper learning online, but it was still a minority of the online learning. Well, 2020 happened. What can I say? And things have changed. Obviously now the face-to-face training has virtually disappeared. And we are in a whole nother world. We're in a world where all of us that are at least in the professional knowledge working, professional learning space, we all have to become production experts, just like we are now. We have to be our own video operators, our own sound engineers. How many times have you had to play with your microphone or check your AirPod Bluetooth connections or just even dial in on the telephone as a backup plan. We have to be our own production coordinators, showrunners, and on top of that, we have to be the on-air talent as well. Now, wouldn't it be great if we actually had a studio like they do for TV productions where, maybe 15 minutes before your first Zoom meeting of the day, someone hands you a cup of coffee, gives you some notes and highlights for you, some talking points. Someone rushes by and does some hair and makeup. Wouldn't that be great? Sure it would, but the fact is that we're left to our own devices to do this now. That is something that is new for all of us. When it comes to, and that's just everyday life for meetings now as well as training, when it comes to training, we now have moved very quickly to VILT, virtual instructor-led training. It's essentially what we're doing now. We're on this web conference call together, and it has been a godsend for us. We are able to quickly switch over. A few things in its favor. One is that video conferencing technology is decades old. It's been well studied. There are paradigms and approaches to doing that. Two, the teaching methods can stay more or less the same in terms of how you have an instructor interact with people. Of course, it is more challenging online. There are limitations. There are a lot of best practices in how to do that, and not everybody's fully up to speed. But more or less, you're not disturbing the approach if you keep these VILT sessions relatively small and intimate. And then tools have improved. So Zoom has just risen and has done a tremendous job. It has also provoked Microsoft to improve its video conferencing solutions. Now they have Teams, and it also does a great job, and there are other tools out there. So we have seen organizations just switch over very quickly when they need to VILT. And they do that because they recognize that training is not something you can put on hold indefinitely. If anything, people need development now more than at any time in the past. All right. But VILT is not perfect. It's a great short-term solution, but is it sustainable? People who are experienced in these areas know that it isn't great for all training. What you see on the right is a Google Trends chart of the phrase Zoom fatigue. You see when it peaked, and you see it kind of bumping around there, people searching for that phrase in 2020. What I want to point out is that spike in April was pretty soon after the pandemic started. So within a couple of months. So Zoom fatigue quickly sets in. It's not one of these things where you can live for 6 or 9 months and then worry about Zoom fatigue. Or to be fair, I should call it webinar fatigue. But it does set in very quickly. So what are people doing in response to this? They're keeping the sizes of their VILT small. So, less than 40 people, similar to a size that you do in an in-person training, so you can have the facilitator try to do the same types of things. Note that there are nearly 200 people in this session right now. So we would not be able to do this in that same intimate training-focused way. If we split up 200 people into 40 people or less, that would be 5 different sessions that we'd have to schedule and so on. They're also keeping it short. So breaking up training sessions. Let's say you did a one-day training that was normally 6 hours in duration. Well, if you break that up into 90 minutes each, that's 4 different sessions. But now you have the challenge of how do you schedule those 4 sessions so that people can make them all? Now you run into big logistical problems. Are you scheduling them on consecutive days? Is it you're trying to do 2 a day over 2 days, right? As soon as people miss substantial portions of those sections, you're kind of in trouble. So we are seeing the limits of this VILT approach, and that's where we want to talk about some of the fatigue that sets in, some of the challenges, and how a blended approach can address those challenges. Now, I want to run a quick poll, and Jess can run this for us, and it will pop up for you. How engaged are you during your virtual work meetings? And please just pick one that picks the best answer to how you kind of perceive things, and we'll see. Take a look at what people say. All right. Do we have some results yet, Jess?
Yes, it looks like about 80% of the people here have responded. So let me go ahead and end the poll here, and I'll go ahead and share the results with you.
All right, taking a look at this, the largest one by a little bit is actively listening and providing live feedback. That's terrific. So a third of you, which is great. So I expect to see that, by the way, manifest itself here in this session in the chat and the Q&A. But nearly that number as well, trying but often zoning out, can certainly understand that. Paying attention but usually silent, so a little bit more passive would be about a quarter, and then a full 10%, 11% actively multitasking. All right, this poll, this exact poll was actually sent out in a large site called Blind, and there were nearly 5,000 respondents to this. You can see their responses, and it's somewhat similar, although this group here, hopefully all being affiliated with L&D, we certainly report ourselves actively listening and providing more live feedback than the general population. This is not a random controlled sample, but it does give you a sense of how people are talking about what they do during these meetings. All right, I want to ask Connie a question now with regards to VILT, so moving to web conference-based training. What are you hearing from the different clients that you work with, Connie?
Yeah, great question. And I can tell you that we are talking to clients every day about utilizing VILTs for their training programs. And it's not that clients have never designed VILTs previously. However, for the first time, they're now looking at their training programs differently and have to convert classroom to virtual. And it isn't just one program, it's many programs. They are concerned about the learner's overall time on web calls, not only virtual sessions, all of the other meetings that happen during the day, and they wonder, are their employees experiencing Zoom fatigue? So they are also concerned about engagement, since they cannot rely on classroom activities with which they are familiar. Very few clients have deep experience converting classroom materials or creating an engaging and experiential experience, but we partner with them. We share best practices and what works, what doesn't work. For example, do you need a whole day of virtual training? Probably not. We ask and we split up the session over multiple days or multiple weeks, and can we give the learners time to reflect and apply between sessions? We help them view virtual training from the learner's point of view and design for results and engagement. And this means you start interacting with the learners right from the first minute of the virtual session. You warm them up to the group experience, and then after that, engage them every 5 minutes to make sure that they're engaged and that you have an impactful virtual sessions. Remember, the goal is to change behavior and not just check the box.
All right, thank you, Connie. So next, what I'd like to do is just spend a few minutes talking about the cognitive strain that we're facing with these webinar tools in our everyday meetings, not just training. And what I've done is I've taken a look at what's out there. There's a lot written about Zoom fatigue, just kind of synthesize things into 3 areas. 2 of them are kind of the primary. One of them is a little bit conjectural, but just wanted to present this to you to see if it's a useful model to think about this. So 3 causes of this fatigue, the Zoom fatigue, if you will. I'll talk about each of these, but essentially there's an information mismatch. There's pressure from being always on and always visible. And then there's some boundary anxiety as we mix our personal and professional lives together. First, let me talk about information mismatch. There's actually simultaneously too little and too much information when we are in webinar, web conference sessions together, looking at each other's heads and shoulders, upper torsos. With that image on the left there, the famous statues on Easter Island, it's akin to this. When we see other people from a psychological standpoint, our brains naturally look for nonverbal cues. And we look for that in body language. We look for that in posture and gestures and various other things. And that information is simply not there. We only have the face. And so our brains are actively looking for and trying to process information that isn't there. That's something that's different for them. We're just not used to seeing disembodied faces. And so that causes some cognitive strain. That's a case of too little information. At the same time, we also have too much information. So if you look in the other picture here, when you see someone's face all of the time, constantly, you're getting a lot of data from facial expressions. We have even a special part of our brain that deals with facial recognition. It's automatic for us. We're constantly doing that. Now, when we're in a group of people in person, we might be looking at the speaker all the time, but our gaze shifts. We look around at different people. We don't have 10 or 12 or 15 faces staring at us the whole time. And that's a lot of information to process. Add on top of that, that people might have facial reactions to things that are off camera. They might be multitasking, checking their email, shows some surprised look, and your brain is trying to register that relative to what is being said. You can see why in some cases, just having a phone call might actually be easier and less strainful than having a video call, because you don't have that expectation of additional information and you don't have all the extra facial information as well. Some research has been done on preferred gaze duration, by the way. That is how long people like to see a direct eye contact, and that's at about 3 seconds. So after 3 seconds, a direct gaze is perceived as either potentially threatening or overly intimate. And I think neither of those are things that we're trying to accomplish in our training sessions. So this is one big area for cognitive strain. Some people will say there's too much, too little information. I think it's both, and this is how a helpful way to think about it. The second is, let me give an example of mirrors in an elevator. Why are there mirrors in an elevator? I think many of us have kind of heard this story. The answer is that the wait times are perceived to be a lot shorter when there are mirrors in an elevator, because then people can look at one of the most fascinating objects in the world, which is themselves, right? You pass by a mirror, you naturally check yourself out. In fact, I want you all to do this if you can. If you have a screen in Zoom where you can see your own face, take a moment right now, look at your face and your background, and just think about what you're noticing, what you're looking at, what you're looking for as you do that. I'll do the same. Let's just take 5 seconds to do that. All right. So I don't know about you, but you're presenting yourself. When you see a picture of yourself like this, right? You're seeing, hey, how's my are my collars even? How's my hair? Is my shelter-in-place haircut working out well for me? How's my background? Are things in it that I want in terms of a composition and so forth? So the fact is that not only are we fascinated with looking at ourselves, but we're not used to looking at ourselves when we're talking all the time, right? So we have this strange dynamic where we see ourselves often, unless we minimize it or close that. And that causes us to be very conscious of our own appearance, of our own presented self. It tires you out the same way you'd be tired out if you were presenting on stage and you knew that everyone was looking at you. There's that extra level of awareness that you're keeping up. And that is another cause for cognitive strain that's different from just being in a face-to-face interaction. Let me talk about the third And that is what I'm calling environmental fragility. Without offices, those of us that are working from home, we have to manage our own environments. And we have to craft a certain environment and paint a certain picture. This causes some anxiety. I'm calling it environmental fragility anxiety. You know, what if a dog barks? What if my child or toddler yells something out? What if there's a lawnmower out in the background? Did I lock the door? Someone could burst through the door. And what are we afraid of? We're afraid that we're actually creating this facade. And that facade is, even though I'm home, I'm in a professional space. This is a separate area. It's hermetically sealed. And we're essentially trying to be these disembodied heads and upper torsos that are in this just very, sanitary separate space, right? That ultimately is not human, right? That is not who we are. Our personal lives are being merged into our working lives, and trying to create this separate world and keep the two worlds separate creates a lot of extra strain. And so I think there's anxiety that comes into play with that as well. This adds to the cognitive strain. So we've got the three elements: too little or too much information, constant raised self-awareness and being conscious of being visible at all times, and being anxious about the environment that you're in. These are what I think are the primary contributors to this Zoom fatigue. But guess what? The Zoom fatigue doesn't just affect your training programs. Our working lives now are reliant for professional workers that are office workers, if you will, right? Our working lives are reliant on web conferences. So what does it mean if we're adding to Zoom fatigue? Unfortunately, what it means is that if you've got training programs that are on a web conference and you're contributing or you're hastening that Zoom fatigue, what you could be doing ultimately is not just providing ineffective training, you could be harming the productivity of your whole organization. You could be making working meetings less productive by adding to that cumulative Zoom fatigue. So the exact opposite of what we're trying to do in the learning and development sphere, of course, right? I mean, that's not exactly going to look very good on a CLO Learning and Practice Award application, right? Unless they're ambiguous about how they use the term impact, this is not the kind of impact that you want to have where you lower the productivity in your organization and now the company bans all meetings more than 30 minutes because of the cumulative Zoom fatigue that's being presented. Having said this, I don't want to diminish the role of VILT. VILT plays an important role, especially if it's a shorter program. If it's an hour or less, I think VILT can be very powerful if you keep it into smaller numbers. Obviously, it's very versatile and very important tool in our toolkit. There are emerging technologies. VILT is going to get better. Zoom is going to get better. They're adding features all the time. It's actually kind of frustrating. Sometimes you go in and things change, and it's because they've added some features or changed some configurations. Microsoft Teams is going to get better. Here's an example of something that improves on VILT. It's a small startup from the founder was a former CEO of Evernote, Phil Libin. This is called That's actually the name of the app. You can go and check it out. What it allows you to do is you can use a green screen or not if you want in the background, and you can share your screen or share a presentation, have it be just one component of what you show, and have yourself, you can grow or shrink your own image so that you can point to things behind you and interact with the material as well as with the audience. So sort of like what happens in a TV broadcast with a weather person or something like that. So clearly there will be improvements to VILT, but these right now are not a long-term sustainable solution. What we really want to now talk about is how you can get much better results from incorporating blending concepts. So before we get into that, let me just pause a little bit and see if there are any questions regarding any of the materials that we've talked about thus far. and then we'll get started and talk about this new approach to blending. Please feel free to use the Q&A as opposed to just the chat. There might be a lot of things going on in the chat, but specific questions for Connie or myself, please go ahead and put in Q&A. And Connie, do you see anything there? I know you're checking it out.
Yes, I do. And I'm actually reading through the question. I hear about some sort of synchronous or asynchronous activity may help with interaction if does not take place in real time. Could it help alleviate the cognitive strain? Thinking about that approach may be appropriate for every meeting, but there could be some other use cases. So yes, we absolutely do believe that asynchronous activities where interaction does not take place in real time can be very valuable and very powerful. And I believe that we're going to be giving some examples of that here shortly.
Yeah, we can, let's address that through what we're going to talk about and then get to that. So let's move on to the new approach to learning. And the first thing, you know, as L&D professionals, we always go back to basics. The basics for us are learning principles, the learning science. So here are the things that we want to try to follow in terms of the relevant principles in order to reduce that cognitive strain and keep effectiveness high. One is that we want to minimize cognitive load. Second, we want to vary the stimuli. So instead of just having video and slides and things like this, we have the opportunity to introduce more different types of things in a blended program, something to read, something to listen to, something to go and check out, some reference materials, things like that. That is an important learning concept. Next, we want to scaffold a progression. So the point with good blended designs is not just to throw a bunch of resources out there or say, hey, here's some pre-work, just look through the pre-work and then you'll be ready. But really to ladder people up and to scaffold them up into higher level concepts and goals. And we'll talk about how we do that. Clearly focusing on application. This is important and it makes it relevant for people. And we've got some opportunities to do that even better in a blended program. The final one that I want to make a strong case for is cultivating nuance. When we talk about the skills that professionals need today, they are not skills that are related to recalling facts. They're not skills around, oh yes, I know the 5-step sales process and the checkpoints in between each of the 5. It's not knowing that, it's the nuances. When does something apply? When does it not apply? When does it seem like maybe it wouldn't apply, but in this case it does, right? Those are things related to judgment. It relates to robustness of knowledge. From a learning design, learning science standpoint, the concept is transferability. Is it near transfer or far transfer? You want to incorporate that nuance that people can develop as they go through these things. So how do we incorporate these into a blended program? We want to describe that blended approaches, first of all, vary all over the map. And when we talk about blended, what we mean is essentially combining things that are live and things that are asynchronous. So synchronous versus asynchronous and combining them together. Now, live can be VILT, which it is probably in most cases today, but live could also be face-to-face. And if we're here a year from now and there are face-to-face trainings starting back up, these blended concepts still work. You can incorporate face-to-face and asynchronous, you can incorporate VILT and asynchronous, and you can even combine all three. The benefits are the following: flexibility for participants, and you don't have to force people to attend 4 90-minute sessions that happen on specific days and at specific times. That application, you can have people work on authentic contexts, and you can provide different modalities of materials for people, for them to learn. This is what we talk about when we talk about bringing the humanity back to learning. Instead of focusing on that VILT, that sort of artificial stage where there's 20 faces staring at you, you yourself are one of those faces looking at yourself, and you're a disembodied head. instead of just conforming to that technology, you can really use these blended programs to have the technology conform to you. Let's make things flexible for people. Let's make it relevant and real in their actual lives. And let's make it so that they can absorb that information well. Let me paint a little picture of what that looks like conceptually. So with these blended programs, if you combine the asynchronous and synchronous, you can stretch that learning out over time. And Connie made reference to it in one of her examples where you might stretch things out over a couple of weeks that you would otherwise have as a single one-time event. A half-day training of 4 hours, you might stretch that into 3 weeks of an hour and a half each week over 3 weeks. There's some benefits of stretching it out. One is that you can have people practice in their actual working environment. That's not something you can do if you just have them in a workshop for half a day. There is time for reflection. There's time for feedback, both getting and giving feedback. Now you've got opportunities like this in a blended environment. And we also know from the learning science that reinforcement is important, that you need to constantly reinforce and help scaffold people up as they're building up new skills. So these things become a lot more possible in a blended environment. The real key to this is, we call it the secret sauce, is this sort of combination of asynchronous and synchronous. And right here, I'm referring to it as something that's paced. So synchronous obviously is something live, like a VILT session or an in-person session. Asynchronous is you go online most likely and go and look through some materials, but you do it solo. You do it at your own pace, right? We have this concept in the middle where it's paced, where you've got the flexibility to go through the asynchronous components, but it's on a schedule. So maybe it's over 3 weeks and you're supposed to cover 1 module per week. This has 2 big benefits to it. First, it boosts motivation. There's something psychologically powerful about being behind or being on track, and just getting that reminder, hey, we've started week 2. It's not too late to finish week 1. People just kind of keep track of that mentally. Now, it doesn't mean they're going to follow through, but at least they know they're behind, and there's that sense that they should be moving along at a certain pace. If you leave it up to people themselves, it's very, very unlikely that people complete even what they plan to complete or what they want to complete. The second big benefit is that it synchronizes activity. So you keep people thinking about the same topics at the same time. Now, you're probably familiar with discussions in e-learning. The problem with those is that they're usually ghost towns. So you come across a discussion question, the last post was 3 weeks or 3 months ago. That's not very encouraging for people to want to participate. It feels dead. How can you make it feel lively? Well, one key is having these things paced so that on week 1, everybody's thinking about the topic for week 1. Week 2, everybody's thinking about the topic for week 2. As soon as people post a question or a thought, there's 3 or 4 other people that are chiming in within 20 minutes, within an hour or 2. So that actually creates a lot more energy and dynamism into the program. And we'll give you more examples about what it means to create a paced program. And especially at the very end, Connie will go into a very specific case study that should give you a good picture of this. If you put these things together and you put them in a sequence, here is what you could achieve. This is just a conceptual picture of a journey that you would put people on, maybe instead of a 4-day in-person training. Maybe this is a new manager training or a high potential leadership training or a design thinking training, something like that. You can see there's different activities that are sequenced at a certain point in time. You see the little orange ones, which are live events. So there's a kickoff video call near the beginning. There's a wrap-up video call near the end. But there are other things that are happening here. There's curated content. There's opportunities to practice or apply. Interaction between peers and mentors, between teams. Now, this is an example conceptualized for what you can do on the NovoEd platform as an overarching platform. But you could use other tools for this. And people try to use sometimes a combination of other tools where you have them collaborate and see resources in different spaces. But this is the overall goal, is to create something like this that's unified, that's overarching, that people feel that they're making progress towards some objective. I don't want to imply that blending is nirvana. There are challenges for this. So with each of the 3 benefits that I described, I'm going to describe some of the challenges. So with that flexibility that you're offering to participants, what's the #1 challenge there? Keeping people on track, making sure if you can't complete the training in one sitting, how do you get them back? That's traditionally been a major problem. Probably the #1 problem in deeper e-learning is getting people to come back, keeping them on track. How do you establish norms that people should be having conversations around certain things? They should be giving feedback around certain things. For the authentic context, it's one thing to just simply say, hey, go out and apply this to your working life. But how do you get people to provide, to get feedback? How are they going to get feedback on that? Either from experts or from their peers? How are they seeing how their peers are doing things? These are important to developing that judgment, sharpening it, developing that nuance. With the multimodal approach, the big challenge there is simplicity. How do you keep the user experience, especially in our technology-enabled world, how do you keep it seamless? How do you keep that journey clear and consistent and not have people switch into different tools? You know, you could create a solution that incorporates 5 different tools. You know, first go to Slack and do this, and then come over here to these box folders and then this SharePoint drive and do that. At some point, if you ask people to do too much from a user interface standpoint, they'll simply fatigue out from that. So a different type of fatigue. So there's ways to address all of these challenges. And we don't have time to get into a lot of those things there, but there are some recent advances and things that we've learned over the past couple of decades from psychology, sociology. Obviously, there's technology tools that can help us address a lot of these things. There's one thing in particular that I want to focus on here, which is this idea of taking that idea of having people being paced and taking it up a level into cohorts. So here, as sort of a testament to the power of social learning, that deeper interactive learning where people interact with each other, they're not just operating in a completely isolated fashion. A few thought leaders, so we've got Josh Bersin. It's a well-known fact that collaborative cohort-based learning is the most valuable, useful, and memorable way to learn. The Fosway group, which operates a lot in Europe, being great at something comes from purposeful practice, feedback, intelligence, coaching, resilience, hard work, reflection, and tenacity. These are the types of things that you want to incorporate in your blended program. And then from a trends report from BCG, relationship-based learning uses expert and community learning networks to stimulate reflection and reinforcement. So now you're seeing some of these themes, right? There's a thoughtfulness, there's a depth to what you want to try to cultivate. And if we're not going to do that in in-person sessions so much anymore in the future, if we're going to rely less on that modality, how do we get that into the online modality? All right. So next, want to tee up a question for Connie. After we do that, we'll take a couple more questions. But how have you combined this, synchronous and asynchronous into an overarching flow? What have you seen there that has worked?
Another great question. Blended learning is really part of the secret sauce, I believe that you had said, and we start with being very mindful of the best of both worlds for our clients. I mean, you don't want to just rely on synchronous. We want to mix it up. And what does that mean? Well, we want to combine asynchronous elements to provide opportunities above and beyond the classroom. So you can start by tying your journey together and take these elements to allow for them to practice the application, the ability to highlight learnings and bring senior leaders' attention to them through platforms such as NovoEd. A few elements to talk about and the importance of them are things like a virtual kickoff. You need to provide that kickoff. The learner feels they're part of the same cohort. There's a little bit of pressure to get started. You set expectations, you answer questions. Curated content on a platform gives the learner a different way to explore the topic and to Let's dive deeper. Discussions, opportunity to share your thoughts, to compelling questions, and to see what your peers have to say about the same thing. It expands your thinking when you share that knowledge. And Charlie, you had talked about feedback. When the learner receives feedback from others and not just their manager, there's an openness to receiving that feedback and then applying the feedback. Another item that we utilize, team projects, to build cohesiveness towards a common goal. And you have interactive electronic documents that provide the learner with a framework and helps them execute on the knowledge that they're learning. It's also a place for them to reflect and journal key takeaways. And one of our attendees had asked just about the importance of reflecting and journaling, not only to the individual, but to the group. When an individual dives deep and reflects and finds new learnings, they will bring that back to the group. And the group, again, just the knowledge is expanded and people start to understand, wow, I didn't realize you felt that way, or I felt the same way. And that's a great way to move forward. At the end, virtual wrap-ups, very important. There's that accountability that you had talked about to make sure that they are on track. You want to celebrate what they achieved together. And it's also important to ask them to share at the end of any journey, what is one action that you are going to take tomorrow to apply their new skills? You want them to take a next step. You want them to take an action and just make it one, just one. That will start the journey. So, you know, blended journeys give us flexibility and keeps the learner thinking about the same thing at the same time.
Thanks, Connie. And to your last point about asking people to take one action at the end, the nice thing, the power of the blended when you have multiple sessions is that you don't just have to do it at the end. You can do it in the middle and then not only ask them to do or try one thing, but then to say, okay, come back the next session or the next time and report back how it went. Did you try what you said you would? What was the result? What did you learn from that? And what would you do differently, right? So there's just so much power in opening things up into a blended environment. I see a question in the Q&A around getting feedback and so forth. In a blended environment, it's much easier to get feedback because you can have people fill out quick surveys. They can be anonymous or they can be non-anonymous, either way. And you can constantly adjust as you go. All right, so the final stage, and I want to leave time for your feedback here, Connie, is what we've covered so far is, where we are today, the strain that we have, the boon that VILT has been, but the strain that causes, and the fact that there is a new approach to blending and incorporating richer elements into a blended approach. I just want to walk through quickly 5 steps, a framework for creating a blend. And we actually have another whole webinar on this topic if you're interested in more detail. But let me go through this very quickly here. The first thing that I would recommend is that we isolate for a particular training objective. We isolate what the magic of face-to-face is and identify how important those are for your training. So the magic of face-to-face, I would summarize it in 3 things. The relationships that people build with each other, the amount of facilitation that people can get from experts, and the visibility and interaction people have with their peers. So these are things that make that face-to-face really rich. People come away from it saying, oh, I got to know so-and-so, my colleague, I understand their perspective, or they come away with a more seasoned understanding of that topic. So once you understand that, here are the 5 steps. You want to determine what the drivers are of your learning program, the drivers of what is going to cause that learning to happen. You want to assess potential tools you have to make that happen online if you can. Step 3 is you want to address the gaps. So there might be spots where it's obvious you want to use VILT or a live training, an in-person training. Step 4 is then you design your mix between asynchronous and synchronous. And then step 5 is you create that scaffolded path or journey together. So going through each of these briefly, step 1, determining the drivers. Here are the 3 elements I described earlier: relationships, facilitation, peer learning. And for each of these, just assessing where your needs are for that particular training program. In this particular case, does it need to be social or is solo fine? Will feedback be an important aspect, or is it pure exposition, explanation that's going to get the learning objectives completed? Is the topic and subject matter highly nuanced, or is it fairly basic? So you put, your dots along these 3 dimensions. Then you look for tools that you can utilize that can help you do some of those things online. So here are different categories of tools: VILT tools, collaboration tools, e-learning authoring tools where you might create things like animated presentations or simulations, interactive resources. Connie described an interactive document and so forth. So you pick what's necessary. However, this is the filter I would recommend that you go through, is you think about availability, usability, and value. So availability, what could really be accessible to your organization, or what could you introduce realistically? Usability, are you asking people to switch too much? Is it, is it seamless? Is it easy to use? Is it keep the cognitive load low? Remember, that's one of our objectives. And then is there value for use in that? Is it worth it for what you're asking them to do, or is some other tool close enough? Then you can address these gaps, and you can put in what your current tool set allows you to do, and you can see the difference between them is the gap. So right here you can see that we need more social than our tools allow. We're just fine on feedback and a little bit more on nuance. So this helps you think about what sessions to fill those gaps. I would make those the synchronous activities. You can have different models of these designs. You can see here in terms of the live training and the online modules, here are a few different models. That first model is you do a live session, and then you have follow-up online. The second one is the reverse, where it's sort of pre-work. You have people do some stuff online to prepare, then you have a culminating live session. If you've got something richer, maybe you combine it and you do a kickoff, and then you have some online modules with a webinar somewhere in there. And you could even get richer as well and have multiple live sessions if you've got a really deep, rich training. So, you'll have these slides for reference. You can take a look at them. But this is the type of blended program that you structure that you want to put together. And then you design that journey, that scaffolding that we talked about, or that path. Here's an example of some sample learning objectives you might have and how those translate into tech-enabled activities. So you might utilize videos, discussions, polls, presentations. You could do role plays and self-reflections. You could do those live, but you could also do those using some technology. And then virtual sessions and peer feedback. So you see it goes from the basic to the most rich. And these are the things that you want to design when you're crafting that overarching journey. So those are the 5 steps, 1 through 5. I know I went through those briefly, but there's definitely more information. Reach out to me if you want a link to another webinar that spends a full hour on this. But the end result is you've got your tech-enabled activities, you've got your design of here's what's asynchronous, here's what's synchronous, and it's all focused on meeting your learning objectives. All right, with that, I would like to invite Connie to walk us through a specific case study in a little bit more depth so you can see what it actually looks like to put one of these things together.
Great, thank you very much, Charlie. The case study is National Grid, and National Grid, in case you're not familiar with them, they're one of the largest energy companies in the world with revenue 20 billion and 23,000 employees in the United States in the northeast of, United Kingdom in the northeast of the United States. Like many other companies, they use employee engagement surveys to understand where they can do better. And we worked with them to assess the result, and we focused in on a few leadership gaps. And I put the top 3 here. Their industry was changing. There's new technologies, there's digitalization. Senior leaders needed to find new ways to lead change and drive innovation. They were also not collaborating enough to break down barriers and leverage peer-to-peer expertise. So we gathered all the data from our assessments, and on the next slide, here's the solution that we proposed. So many of these elements are going to sound familiar to you. I'm not going to hammer those home, but we designed this journey on the Novoa platform. This allowed us to provide the learners with flexibility, and it allowed us to bake in all of the technologies that we wanted to use to make the experience engaging. For example, we proposed small, diverse groups of senior leaders and peer discussion opportunities, peer team formation, and affinity groups. This solved for the relationship building in the senior group. It helped build trust to support each other in the future. Another important element that we added was the bright idea and the Energize blueprint. Think of this as an overall project thread that pulls all of the new skills together and helps them make sense of the journey. At the beginning of the journey, they propose a bright idea that they're going to tackle for the company and their team. And then over the next 26 weeks, they go back to the bright idea and they apply the new skills and knowledge that they have to that idea, and they start building their Energize blueprint, which is basically strategy on a page. So this thread pulled throughout the entire program, and it ended with them recording a final video presentation of their bright idea and how they would execute. So let's take a look at what this looks like when it's all pulled together. So it's important to bring things together in a coherent journey. You can have everything in the world, but you have to guide them. And this experience map here helps the learner to visualize the journey. They see the WebEx events, they see the 4 core modules of the journey they're going to take. Over in the right-hand top of the map, they see some gray dots that show elective modules that they can select any topic that's relevant to them. So the experience map really shows there's a beginning, there's a middle, there's an end to the journey, keeps everybody on the same page. And over on the right, you're going to see little icons that show all the different technologies and activities we used in the program. We're very thoughtful about the placement, trying not to overuse any of them to keep it engaging. We turned the training into an initiative. I mean, that's the bottom line. It was an initiative to lead change and drive innovation, had high visibility and support from the CEO, with the quote there, who stressed how strategic it was for everyone, how important it was to National Grid. So on the next slide, let's take a look at what a few senior leaders had to say about Energize Our Business. You'll see here some of the highlights is gaining strength, having gone through the program. They enjoyed responding to the reflections of their peers. They found it powerful and enlightening. They felt it was a very deep and impactful experience. They felt as if they had flexibility that allowed them to complete the program, especially at this level of leadership. And of course, one of them had shared this was the most impactful training that they had undertaken. So it's nice to hear those comments from the learners. The program also won 2 different awards, and those are nice as well, but the learner feedback and the application that made, that was pretty special.
Yeah, and I just want to reinforce that even further, Connie, because in my experience, it's one thing to train, say, new managers who are eager to be successful in that role and you know are stepping up to an opportunity. It's a whole nother animal to train senior leaders, people who are the busiest people in the organization. They often you know are very experienced and aren't necessarily always the most open to feedback. One more thing, and then we'll get to a few of the questions. And then Connie, if you could look at the Q&A questions, I see a couple popping up in the chat. But one more thing I want to just let everyone know about here. And on the final page here, this is a summary that we created just for you. You can use it as a reference. It summarizes a lot of the concepts that we covered. It covers on the left, the 3 elements of Zoom fatigue, the 3 contributors. It talks about the what of the blending approach, how it can be stretched out over time. It mentions the challenges, both the benefits and the challenges. And then down below is the how, where you can see, think about the magic of face-to-face, go through the 5-step blending process and end up with your blending design. So just wanted to describe that a little bit. And now in our last couple minutes, we'll just take any major Q&A questions. I see a couple in the chat related to metrics, maintenance, and so forth. I'll address those very quickly. One is metrics. You have the opportunity in blended programs to actually generate a good deal of metrics depending on what your tools allow you to capture. But if you can see things like when people access things, how much time they spend someplace, and activity, consumption of content, then you're going to get a lot of clues as to what's happening. It'll actually give you an idea of whether your content is good or poor. So a lot of opportunities for capturing data from a blended type program. In terms of maintenance, that's a whole nother topic, which is a great topic, and that is how much facilitation do you actually want to provide? You know, one side of the equation is the amount of facilitation it would take to provide an optimal learning experience to meet the learning objectives of the program. That's on one side of the ledger. On the other side of the ledger is how much facilitation effort does that require? How much maintenance does that require? And can you allocate that level of time? Well, one good thing is that you can take your existing trainers and you know, they could still do some portfolio of live sessions, but they could oversee a lot of the blended sessions as well. Maybe not all of the trainers would be tech savvy enough to be comfortable doing that, but certainly the leading ones, the most sort of forward-thinking ones, could be deployed into that role, and they could have, you know, a higher impact in terms of reaching managing a much larger number. I would suggest 5 to 10x the number of people with about the same amount of time. Connie, any other major questions jump out at you in our final minute?
Yeah. Actually, there is one question about what components or elements or technologies that could be detrimental if overused or not sequenced properly in a blended approach. I thought that was
I'll let you answer that from a deep practitioner's standpoint.
Yeah, there are some unique technologies that you do not want to overuse. For example, you can have individuals videotape their responses to questions or introducing themselves or to do a presentation. Overdoing that one sometimes has detrimental effects. You will have people who do not want to participate in that, and instead of trying, because they know it's only once or twice through a journey, that they will completely shut down and not even try.
Yeah, and certainly if you had a PowerPoint deck that was 60 slides long or something like that, not the most helpful thing to have someone look through on their own. Speaking of long PowerPoint decks, though, we will make ours available to you. It is less than 60 slides, but it does have some additional slides in the reference section that you might find helpful as well. Want to thank everyone, and I'll pass it back to Jess for a closing comment.
Thank you so much, Charlie and Connie, for that wonderful presentation. And again, thank you everyone here for joining us.